It gives me a great pleasure to introduce Professor George Gaskell from the London School of Economics, who's going to be talking to us about the additional study that he did from the 2010 Eurobarometer results, and in particular looking at a very fascinating cluster analysis with regards to trust and what that means in terms of understanding how we can better be communicating with different sections of the European population. So George, if you care to come to the podium.
So welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me to give this presentation. My background is basically an undisciplined social scientist with a bit of a training in physiology. And that means I can talk authoritatively as long as there are no experts in the room on almost anything. So I was going to start off with a little sort of discussion about the role of food in culture, the production, the consumption and the so forth of food, and how really food ways are part and parcel of culture. But Laura tells me I've got 20 minutes, so I'll cut out that piece of throat clearing and just tell you a bit about the Eurobarometer survey. It's a survey which is conducted by TNS, a commercial company, who do the Eurobarometers. It involves representative samples from all of the member states, about 1,000 people from each member state. And given that it is a random sample of the population, we can make reasonably confident generalizations to the population of Europe as a whole. So a figure of 1% in the Eurobarometer represents 5 million people, which, you know, it's quite amazing when you think about it. And what I'm going to talk about today is what concerns do Europeans have about food, what is trust, and who is trusted. So unusually in a survey, because often surveys are closed questions where there's a statement and people agree or disagree with it, we started in this survey with an open question. Can you tell me in your own words what are all the things that come to your mind when thinking about possible problems and risks associated with food and eating? Now, about 85% of the people sampled made some comment on this and mentioned a particular concern. 8% said there are no problems at all, and 8% stayed silent. And the interesting thing, looking at the transcripts of these comments, is they're not hysterical. They're actually rather, in the majority of cases, matter of fact. There are a few groups, though, for whom FoodRisC is a problem, or food is a problem. And I suppose I would define them as those people who are in financial difficulties and the price of food has been a considerable concern. And then there's another group of people for whom food is a stressor rather than a pleasure. These tend to be young people without children, they're predominantly female, and they're worried about the calories, they're worried about additives, they're worried about just about everything. They're worried about eating, basically. But the vast majority of Europeans are relatively calm and unfazed, I would say. So what I show in this table is we look at all the comments and we've grouped them into 3 blocks. And the 3 blocks are, sorry, I'm having trouble with my eyes at the moment. The 3 blocks are contamination and adulteration. That's additives, chemicals, pesticides, that sort of thing. Then there's food origins and safety controls. And then a very major issue for many people, diet and health. Now, one of the fascinating things about the Eurobarometer and an open question, it gives one insights into local culture. So, for example, contamination and adulteration in the Netherlands is predominantly associated with hormones and antibiotics in meat. In other countries, it's about pesticide residues and this sort of thing. If we look at food safety controls and food origins, in Sweden, for example, imported food is the major concern, whereas in Eastern Europe, the concern is that they don't believe the sell-by dates when they're buying food, they think the sell-by dates are just changed regularly, and so forth. So one of the crucial things that comes out of the Eurobarometer is that while there's some very common themes, there's some common currents of opinion in Europe, when we look at the individual countries, they reveal themselves in relation to the particular country context, to particular problems. For example, Sweden had a bit of difficulty with imported eggs from Poland, I think it was, and there was a lot of salmonella and that sort of thing that has a continued concern in that country. And what you see from this table is that diet and health issues are very much in the minds and in the conversations of Europeans. And oddly enough, it's the Mediterranean countries with the famous Mediterranean diet, which is olive oil and all the rest of it, and we're told it's very good. These people are really concerned about particularly chronic illnesses. When we look at food origins and safety controls, it's Central Europe, and that's the band of countries running through the middle who are most concerned. And when we look at contamination and adulteration, Central Europe least concerned, and this is a major issue right across Europe itself. Now, what those percentages represent is the number of people who mention concerns in this particular area. Now, one of the little puzzles we have is that following that open question, we asked people about 17 risks, things like residues, pollutants, additives, pesticides, nanoparticles, health issues, and so forth. And we asked them, how concerned are you about each of these on a traditional 4-point scale? Maybe it was a 5-point scale. And as you can see, when we look at the column on the right-hand side, the closed question, we get much higher percentages than we get from the open question. And a good example would be the third one from the bottom. We've combined here gene technology and other new technologies, so that's GM, nanoparticles, etc. And 8% of people spontaneously mention these, but when said, are you concerned about this? Over 80%. And we're doing some work at the moment to try and associate the open and closed questions. And it has, I think, some important methodological issues, but it's also an antidote to those people who read the survey, take the closed questions, and if you look at that column, well, you'd think that Europeans were consumed with anxiety about everything apart from no problem, which gets 4%. Now, this is a slightly bothersome slide, but what we also ask people is, were they concerned about other risks in society, things like being a victim of a crime, environmental pollution, the current economic crisis, getting a serious illness. So what we wanted to find is a sort of measure of what we call generalized risk sensitivity. And then we look at that in relation to concern about food risks. So in this bit, these are the countries that are showing lower food risk in relation to their generalized societal anxiety. And in the top left-hand quadrant, those are the countries where the concern about risk is greater than we would expect from their assessment of societal risks. And as you can see, the countries where there's lower food risk concern, Sweden, Great Britain, Estonia, Malta, and those countries where we see more concern, Germany, Hungary, and Italy. But what that suggests is that on the whole, because as you can see it's a pretty good straight line, the correlation between those two is very, very high, that concern about food is not, let's call it sui generis. It is related to levels of anxiety about general societal risks. Now, what do we mean by trust? I think it's important to clarify the issue. We live in a rather complicated world. We face many potential risks. I mean, think of the risks, the potential risks you've confronted travelling here. Some of you came by air, some of you went by train, you got on the metro, maybe you got a taxi, and probably you drifted through the various interchanges and the various modes of transportation, worrying about whether you'd left your phone on or whether you'd packed something in your briefcase, or if you're like me, you were checking your slides and finding out there were one or two terrible errors in the interpretation. But the last thing I was worrying about is whether the train driver was high on amphetamines, whether the taxi driver was going to crash into the next Pantechnicon and leave me in pieces and that sort of thing. So contemporary society is based on division of labor, and most of the time we assume that the people who have particular roles in society carry out their jobs sensibly and with due diligence. But what we're doing here is acting on trust. We are assuming that other people are going to take care of us, so to speak. So trust reduces complexity, it reduces anxiety, and it's a basis for leading an orderly life. But of course it is a risky decision. And after the banking crisis, I saw a thing in the newspaper yesterday that pre-2008, banks had a confidence rating in the UK of about 85%. It's dropped to 18%. So these days, presumably in early 2000s, people went into a bank and assumed these people were upright and proper people dealing carefully with money and so forth. Now you walk into a bank and wonder whether your account is still going to have any money in, as they pay their bonuses to each other and so forth. So just want to make the point, trust is a substitute for knowledge. Now, the German sociologist Luhmann picks up three different issues, which I don't want to dwell on, but it's worth bearing them in mind. In many situations, we act on familiarity. We simply don't ask the question, is something going to go wrong? That's typical of the family, it's typical of transportation, it's typical of very many situations which we go through in everyday life. It's so familiar, it's so taken for granted, we just carry on thinking about something else. Trust are those situations where we make an active decision. We choose, we select someone to make a decision on our behalf. And so that would be the case of a bank, and it would be the case of various areas where we need advice. We choose the consultant, we choose someone who is supposed to be an expert to tell us what we should be doing. But there are other situations where things happen to us where we don't have choice. And for many people, effectively, that's the utility companies. There's not much we can do about, of course we can all in Britain change our utility company supplier, but it's such a bother you don't do it. So there are many situations where decisions are taken on our behalf, but we don't have that opportunity to opt out. We don't have a choice in the matter. Now, I think this is an important distinction between trust and confidence. In everyday life, we use these words interchangeably, and if I have a little bit of time at the end, I will explain why, in a social, scientific, and a societal sense, it does make a difference. But I may not have time to do that. Now, an American sociologist, Barber, identifies three basic expectations on which trust is created. One is compatibility of values. Has the other more or less the same value orientations that we have? Secondly, competence. Is the other somebody who has the expertise to make appropriate decisions? And thirdly, is public and fiduciary responsibility. Will the other behave in your interests, in the public interest, or will they behave in their personal interests? So if we look at bankers these days, there's some doubt about their commitment to public fiduciary responsibility. There's some doubt about their competence, and there's some doubt about their value orientations. But these are three interesting things, and I'll come back at the end to just flag them up. Now, in the Eurobarometer, we asked a question which ran something like this. Suppose a serious food risk were found in a food you eat regularly, chicken, fish, or salad. How much confidence would you have in the following sources to give you accurate information? Now, we had various people. So in the food chain, we had farmers, manufacturers, supermarkets. The regulators included national government, European institutions, and European and national food safety institutions. And the informers included consumer organizations, health professionals, and the media. And as you can see, as Anne-Laure mentioned, trust in scientists is pretty high. Trust in the informers is pretty high. Regulators, moderate levels of trust. And the food chain is, well, not so trusted. Look at Germany, 31%. The EU average, about 53%. Now, it's strange that really, because I've been to various talks and people from the supermarkets talk about their risk assessment procedures and their 24/7 concerns about risk and so forth. If I were in the supermarket business, I'd be worried about this, but equally I'd be worried about the way in which they have, I think, failed to communicate perhaps, how assiduously they take food risks. So, who are the weak links? And here, what we do is divide up the food chain, the regulators, and informers. And as you can see, the food manufacturers come out pretty badly, and so do the supermarkets. A lot of red there. National governments, not so bad. European institutions, and we've put EFSA, but that's really the competent authorities across Europe, including EFSA, that are dealing with food risks, coming out fairly well. Now, as you can see, there are differences between these countries I've selected, as one would expect. My own country, if you mention Europe to half of them, half the population, there's a sort of pathological outcry, and this is very much reflected, but oddly enough, it's not reflected in the United Kingdom's view of EFSA and our own Food Safety Authority, which has developed a high profile and a great deal of respect. And on informers, one of the interesting things here is the red and yellow, orange in the middle, information found on the internet. In a 20-minute survey, there's so much one can do, and we didn't differentiate between internet qua things like the Food Safety Authority or EFSA and internet qua social network, all these other kind of things. But clearly there is a degree of skepticism about the quality of information coming over the internet. So correlates of trust in food safety authorities. Well, greater trust is evidenced by people who show lower concerns about food risks. Inevitably, those people who are worried about additives, calories, and all these other kind of things are probably more likely to be critically scrutinizing what is put out. People who believe that food has become safer, people who believe that they have some personal control, internal control it's called, have higher confidence in food safety authorities. And those people who think of food as a pleasure rather than a stressor also are greater trusters. Interestingly enough, as so often happens in wide-scale survey research across Europe, socio-demographic characteristics really don't play much of a role. And finally, we took lots of the data, lots of different indicators of particular individuals, and we put them together in an enormous data reduction exercise, which is called cluster analysis. And this is not an algorithm. It doesn't come up with one response. It's a heuristic. It comes up with a variety of solutions. And in a way, this is the one we liked. There are other solutions possible. 4 groups of Europeans. The moderates, and this is the sort of centre of gravity of Europe, and they have moderate levels of confidence in public authorities and trust in the food chain. Then you have quite a number of people who we described as uninterested and trusting. They're not terribly interested in food. Food is, just something you pick up in the street or something like this. They're not really engaged with food, but they have high confidence in the authorities. The most worrying group are the fatalists, because these people seem to have high generalized risk sensitivity. They're very engaged with food, they're very worried about food, they have little trust in the food chain, low trust and confidence in public authorities, and they also feel there's not much they can do about anything. These people are, and one often finds in survey research in different domains, this group of people for whom there seems to be almost a detachment from normal, taken for granted everyday life. So, some interesting finding there. I should ask Laura, is our paper available on the website? Or it is? Oh, jolly good. So, Anne-Laure ended up with the brochure on advice on risk communication, recipes for risk communication, some interesting case studies, zoonotics, dioxin, etc. And 3 key lessons come out of this: being open and transparent, timeliness in the provision of information, and evidence of independence. And what does independence mean? It means, really, it's a substitute, I think, for fiduciary responsibility. And those lessons for risk communication, if we go back to Barber's basic expectations that guide, that generate trust, it seems to me at least, those lessons for risk communication are also the building blocks of trust, because they demonstrate value compatibility, they demonstrate competence, dealing with the situation quickly and in a timely fashion, and fiduciary responsibility in terms of independence. And finally, I would say there's one thing you cannot do with trust, and that's demand it. You can only build trust by actions. Those who say, you must trust me, that's an invitation to say, whoa. I remember walking across Blackheath once, going to work, a row of pantechnicons coming in from Dover, and this big red one, and it was Iceland, a food chain, and the logo on it was, food you can trust. And I thought, oh my God, is every other lorry carrying, 20 tons of salmonella? Surely not. So if you raise the issue of trust, you call it into question. It must never be demanded. Thank you very much indeed.